Where is security? Get this useless woman out of here. Celeste Carter said those words into the microphone right in the middle of the ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel in front of more than 200 guests. Her voice did not tremble. It was calm, clear, and so cold that it made me feel as though I was not a human being but only a stain that needed to be wiped away from the Carter family's perfect evening. My father, William Carter, stood 3 steps away from her. He was wearing a custom tuxedo with a gold pin on his lapel, honoring 35 years of his career. I looked at him waiting for just one sentence. All I needed him to say was, "That is my daughter." But my father looked down at the floor, and in that moment I understood that some people do not lose you with a single stab of the knife. They lose you through every silence they choose. If you have ever been hurt by your own family, but still had to stay silent, comment "I understand," and do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the stories behind that silence. My name is Evelyn Carter. When it happened, I was 34 years old, a restoration architect living in Brooklyn. I did not have a glamorous life like Brianna Celeste's stepdaughter. I drove an old Subaru and spent my life saving buildings that everyone else had forgotten. Maybe that was why they thought I was something that could be torn down too. 2 security guards approached me from both sides. The entire ballroom went silent. The same people who had placed their hands on my shoulder after my mother's funeral now just stood there watching as though I were a minor mistake in the program. Brianna stood near the stage, her phone pointed at me. She was recording the moment I was being thrown out of my own father's celebration. I placed the small velvet box in my hand onto the nearest table. Inside was my mother Margaret Hale's old brass compass. She had given it to my father when they were young, back when she still believed that a man who wanted to build a life first had to know which direction he was going. I looked at my father one last time. "I came here for you," I said. "Not for her. But now I have seen your choice." Then I turned and walked out. The ballroom doors closed behind me. Inside, the jazz music began playing again. Outside, the October wind of New York swept across the freezing stone steps. I stood there wearing my mother's pearl earrings, and for the first time in 23 years, I no longer wondered what I had done wrong. I simply took out my phone. In less than an hour, I signed the order to move $17 million out of the Carter family fund and into a trust Celeste did not know existed. When I turned my phone back on, I had 56 missed calls. But they were not calling to apologize. They were calling because 23 years of Celeste's careful planning had just begun to collapse. Before Celeste came into my life, the house in Westchester used to smell of pine wood drawing paper and morning coffee. My mother, Margaret Hale, was not the kind of woman who shone brightly at grand parties. She shone in a quieter way. She would sit at the kitchen table spreading tracing paper in front of me drawing, while explaining why a wall was not just something that divided a room. Everything beautiful begins with structure. Evelyn, my mother, often said, "If the inside is weak, it does not matter how much gold you paint on the outside." I was 11 years old then. I did not fully understand what she meant. I only loved watching her hand move across the paper, loved the smell of wooden pencils, loved the feeling that I was being allowed into a secret world. Then my mother became ill. Ovarian cancer arrived quickly like a storm with no warning. 8 months passed between the day the doctor said the diagnosis out loud and the day my father stood beside her coffin, his hand resting on my shoulder while his eyes were empty. Adults told me I had to be strong. They said my mother had gone to a better place. But no one told me what I was supposed to do with the empty chair in the kitchen, her box of pencils, and the voice that still echoed in my head every time I saw a drawing. After the funeral, my father changed in a way that was hard to name. He still went to work, still answered phone calls, still wore perfectly pressed suits. But every time I mentioned my mother, he went silent, as though the name Margaret was a door he did not have the courage to open. 8 months later, he brought Celeste home. I remember that morning so clearly that sometimes I can still see the pale sunlight across the kitchen table. I was drawing the floor plan of our house from memory, trying to preserve every small corner before the memory began to fade. My father sat down across from me, his hands clasped together. "Evelyn," he said, "you are going to have a new mother." I looked at him for a long time. There were hundreds of things I wanted to say in my head. "I do not need a new mother. I still have one." But my throat closed up, and in the end I only looked down at the paper. That was the first time I chose silence to keep my father from feeling uncomfortable. Celeste Carter's last name was Vance. Back then. She walked into my mother's house with honey blonde hair, a cream coat, expensive perfume, and a smile that made people believe she knew how to heal a broken family. She called me sweetheart in the first week, but there was not a trace of tenderness in the way she looked at my mother's photograph in the hallway. At first, the changes were very small. One framed photo of my mother was moved out of the living room. Then my mother's books were taken down to the basement. After that, the kitchen table where my mother had taught me how to draw was replaced with a cold, polished marble one. My father said Celeste only wanted to refresh the house, but I knew it was not the house being refreshed. My mother was being erased. Celeste never erased me with loud actions. She was smarter than that. She did not throw my mother's photographs into the trash in front of me. She simply told the housekeeper that the old frames no longer matched the new wall color. She did not forbid my father from mentioning my mother. She only placed a hand on her chest and sighed softly every time the name Margaret was spoken, as though the memory of my mother was an insult to her presence. And my father, William Carter, always chose the easiest path. He stayed silent. In the first year after the wedding, my seat at Thanksgiving dinner was moved from beside my father to the far end of the table. Celeste smiled, placed a hand on my shoulder, and told everyone that I seemed more comfortable sitting away from the crowd. I had never said that, but the whole table heard it nodded, and just like that, my truth was replaced by her sentence. In the second year, the Carter family Christmas card had only 3 people in it: my father, Celeste, and Brianna. When I asked why I was not in the photo, Celeste tilted her head, her face filled with sadness as though she were the one who had been hurt. "Sweetheart, the photographer was in such a hurry that day. Besides, you do not really like having your picture taken, do you?" I used to like it. My mother loved taking pictures of me standing beside old buildings, my hair messy in the wind, both arms wrapped around my drawings. But in that house, everything that had once been me was slowly renamed as something I did not like. By the 4th year, my bedroom had become Celeste's yoga room. My belongings were packed into boxes and moved to the small room at the end of the hallway, the one where overnight guests used to stay. Celeste said I was going to college soon and should not waste so much space. My father stood behind her, holding a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the window. I waited for him to object. He only said, "That sounds reasonable." Maybe that was the sentence that made me understand that abandonment is not always a door slamming shut. Sometimes it is a father standing in the room listening while someone else pushes his daughter out of his life, and then calling it reasonable. Brianna grew up in that house as though it had always belonged to her. She was 2 years younger than me, beautiful, loud, and introduced by Celeste to everyone as our daughter. I was William's daughter from before. Celeste always said the words "from before" very softly, but they cut deeper than any scolding ever could. From before meant I belonged to a chapter that had already ended. From before meant I was the rough draft of a family Celeste had rewritten into something cleaner. The most frightening part was that after a while I began to live exactly in the place she had assigned to me. I walked more quietly, spoke less, ate faster. I learned how to leave a room on my own before someone had to remind me that the conversation was more enjoyable without me. Every time my father looked at me as though he wanted to say something, Celeste would step in, and that look would disappear. I used to think that if I was more obedient, more accomplished, less troublesome, my father would remember that I was his daughter too. But some people do not forget you because their memory is poor. They forget because your silence makes their life easier. I left Westchester as soon as I could. College gave me a legitimate reason to leave, and Brooklyn gave me a place to breathe. I rented a small apartment on the third floor of an old brownstone with wooden floors that creaked softly under my feet and windows facing east. In the morning, sunlight poured into the narrow room like a reminder that not every small place makes you feel trapped. I studied architecture, then chose historic restoration. My work was not glamorous. I did not design glass mansions overlooking the ocean. I did not sign my name beneath skyscrapers. I went looking for rotting libraries, abandoned fire stations, old schools with collapsed roofs and dust, buried in every strip of wood. I learned how to kneel on cold floors to see whether a crack was running into a load-bearing wall. I learned how to shine a flashlight into pitch-dark attics where old beams still held on even after the city had forgotten them. I liked the feeling of touching an old wall and understanding that beneath the peeling paint there was still a structure worth saving. Maybe because I wanted to believe the same thing about myself. In the world of the Carter family, my career was a polite joke. Celeste often asked me in front of guests whether I had found a more stable job yet, as though 10 years of study and work were only a long-passing impulse. Brianna posted photos of handbags, dresses, and first-class flights. The whole family applauded, as though every advertising contract were a true achievement. I earned my own living. I paid my rent, bought my own car, and handled my own bills. But in their eyes, I was still the daughter who needed pity, the one sitting at the edge of parties and driving a Subaru too old to park beside the German cars in the driveway. On the last Christmas before the retirement party, I was invited back home like an obligation. When Brianna showed off her new bracelet, Celeste smiled brightly. When someone asked what I was working on, I told them about the restoration of a Carnegie library in the Hudson Valley. My father looked up, then lowered his eyes back to his plate. Celeste set down her wine glass. That sounds exhausting, Evelyn. But how long do you plan to keep doing such hands-on work? The whole table gave a quiet laugh. No one thought the sentence was cruel. Maybe because when cruelty is wrapped in a gentle voice, people find it easy to call it concern. I drove back to Brooklyn through the cold night. I did not cry. I only understood one more thing. Some houses rot because of time. Some families rot because people keep painting over the truth. 11 months before the retirement party, I was rearranging my Brooklyn apartment on a drizzly afternoon. It was not real cleaning, not exactly. It was the kind of thing people do when their mind is too loud and they need their hands to stay busy, so they do not have to think. I pulled my mother's old cardboard box out from under the bed, the same box that had followed me from Westchester to my college dorm, then through 3 rented apartments. Inside were a few leather-bound notebooks, a box of worn-down pencils, old photographs, and the smell of yellowing paper. In one photo, my mother was standing on a construction site, sawdust in her hair, drawings in her arms, laughing so hard her eyes curved. That was not the frail mother in the hospital bed I had carried with me for years. That was Margaret Hale before the illness, before Celeste, before our house was rewritten. At the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of birthday cards, I found a cream-colored envelope. On the front was my mother's slanted handwriting, a handwriting I recognized instantly, even though I had not seen it on anything new in 23 years. For Evelyn, when you are ready. My hands shook so badly that I had to set the envelope down on the table. There is a strange kind of fear in receiving a message from someone who has died. You want to open it immediately, but you are also afraid that once you do, the last small distance between you and the truth will disappear. At last I sliced open the edge of the envelope. Inside was a sheet of letterhead. The printed words at the top made me stop breathing. Margaret Hale, Architecture and Preservation. I read it again. My mother had been an architect, not a woman who only enjoyed drawing for fun the way my father had always said, not the gentle shadow standing behind William Carter's career. My mother had her own office, her own license, her own name on designs. I might have walked past without knowing. For 23 years, no one had told me that. Not my father. Not my relatives. Beneath the letterhead, my mother had written less than I expected. My beloved daughter, there are things about the family money you need to know when you are old enough. I prepared something to protect what belongs to you. Henry Alden has all the documents. Find him. Behind the letter was an old business card. Henry Alden Trust and Estate Attorney, Midtown Manhattan. I sat on the floor for a long time, surrounded by rain-colored light coming through the window. Everything in my life had shifted slightly. It had not collapsed. Not yet. It was only that a false wall had cracked open, revealing another room behind it. If you believe that some people leave this world but their love still quietly protects us, comment Mother, and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories with twists this deep. That night, I opened my laptop and typed Henry Alden's name. He was still practicing law. I wrote a very short email. I am Evelyn Carter. My mother was Margaret Hale. She left me a letter and told me to find you. 2 hours later, he replied, I have been waiting for this email for 23 years, Ems. Carter. The next morning, I arrived in Midtown Manhattan earlier than my appointment. The building where Henry Alden had his office stood on Madison Avenue, old in the way things are when they no longer need to prove their value. The elevator moved slowly, the hallway was dark, and the heavy wooden door had a brass plaque engraved with his name. In my handbag were my mother's letter and the questions that for 23 years no one had allowed me to ask. When the receptionist invited me in, I felt as if I was not stepping into a law office, but into a locked room inside my family's history. Henry Alden was in his 70s. Silver hair, thin-framed glasses. He looked at me with emotion held very carefully in place. You look more like your mother than I expected, he said. That one sentence alone made my throat tighten. In the Carter house, people always said I looked like my father, like my grandmother, like someone safe enough that they did not have to mention Margaret. No one had ever looked at me and brought my mother back. That way, he placed a brown leather file in front of me. On the first page was my mother's name, Margaret Elise Hale Carter. Her signature rested at the bottom of the page, the blue ink slightly faded but still sharp. Your mother created a protected asset structure, he said. She wanted to make sure the inheritance from the Hale family was not completely blended into the Carter estate. He explained it in very simple terms. Before she married my father, Margaret had received $17 million from the Hale family. That money had been placed into the Carter family fund for joint investment, but my mother had created a separate clause. It was like a locked room inside a large house. Outsiders could see the shared roof, but they had no right to enter that room. You are the sole beneficiary, he said. Since your 30th birthday, you have had full authority to move that money into your own trust. No signature from your father is required. No approval from Celeste is needed. I looked at him and felt the blood in my body go cold. Did my father know? Henry took off his glasses. He did not answer immediately, and that pause told me everything. He was present when the original agreement was signed, he said. William always knew. Down on the street, people were still walking, calling cabs, carrying coffee. And I was sitting in that room hearing the truth that my father had known my mother had left me a protected piece of my life, yet he had still allowed Celeste to make me believe I had nothing. Henry handed me another document. Celeste has contacted the fund management office several times. Recently, she even had an attorney draft, an amendment attempting to redirect the benefits to Brianna. My heart pounded. Can she do that? No, he replied. But if you continue to stay silent, she can make people believe she has the right. I did not sign the transfer order that day. I told Henry I needed time. My father's retirement party was coming up, and I wanted to give him one final chance. Henry looked at me for a long time, then nodded. Your mother would probably understand. But Ems. Carter, everything has been ready for a very long time. When you need it, just call me. I left the office with the documents in my hands. Not because I had been saved, but because for the first time I knew I had the key. 3 weeks before the retirement party, Celeste began moving her final pieces into place. I noticed it through something very small. I sent a message in the family group chat to ask what time we should arrive at the Whitmore Hotel. The message showed as delivered, but no one replied. 1 day. 2 days. 3 days. On the 4th day, I messaged Brianna privately. Is the family group chat broken? 4 hours later, she replied, Oh, Mom made a new group. I guess she forgot to add you. Forgot. The word sounded as light as dust, but I had lived in the Carter house long enough to know Celeste never forgot anyone. She only removed a person and called it an accident. I called the hotel's event coordinator. A woman named Janine answered in a professional voice. I said I wanted to confirm my seat. The line went silent for a few seconds. I'm sorry, Ems. Carter. I don't see your name on the guest list. I was not surprised. The feeling was like seeing a crack in a wall you already knew was rotting from the inside. I thanked Janine, then called Celeste directly. She answered right away. Celeste always answered quickly because she never wanted to look like someone who was avoiding a conversation. Evelyn, what a surprise, she said, sweet as old honey. I wasn't sure you still wanted to come after everything. After what? She stayed silent for exactly 1 beat, just long enough to make me feel as though I should already know what I had done wrong. Well, never mind. I'll have them add your name. But remember, this is a formal event. Don't wear those construction site outfits of yours. I looked down at my hands. There was still a trace of plaster dust beneath my fingernails from the library project. In the past, that sentence would have made me feel ashamed. That day, it only made me more alert. In the days that followed, I began to hear the rumors. Eleanor Marsh, my mother's old best friend, invited me to lunch at a small French restaurant on the Upper East Side. She sat across from me, turning a silver spoon on her plate again and again before finally asking, Evelyn, did you lose your job? I set down my glass of water. Who told you that? Celeste. She said you were unstable, that you were living off your father's money, and that you had been lashing out at the family. She told people they should be understanding if you behaved strangely at the party. I sat still, but inside me it felt as though an old support beam had cracked hard. Celeste was not only taking my name off the list, she was building the story in advance, so that if I was thrown out, the entire room would believe it made sense. Eleanor placed her hand over mine. Your mother would never let anyone call you a burden. That night I returned to my Brooklyn apartment and opened Henry Alden's documents again. I did not want to use them yet. I still wanted to believe that my father would choose me, if everything was pushed to the edge. But that is the problem with hope. Sometimes it does not save you. It only stretches the time before you have to look directly at the truth. 2 weeks before the party, I drove back to Westchester with a gift on the back seat. It was the architectural drawing of the first commercial building my father had ever bought when he was barely in his 30s. I had spent months finding it in the county archives, then restored the brittle edges myself, cleaned the stains, and framed it in walnut wood. I chose that gift because I wanted to tell my father that I still remembered the man he had been before Celeste rewrote him into a statue for parties. I still remembered the man who once drove me to see an old stone building being demolished, then said quietly that my mother would have fought to save it. My father opened the door for me. He looked happy, though his happiness was always held back like a lamp covered by a hand. When I gave him the framed drawing, he stood still for a long time. His fingers moved over the glass, stopping at the corner with the note written in blue ink. Evelyn, he said, his voice rough. Where did you find this? In the county archives. I thought you should have it. For one moment, I saw my father truly return. Not wealthy, William Carter. Not the man who would soon be honored beneath chandeliers. But the man who had once loved building because he believed every building had a soul. Then Celeste appeared at the living room door. She looked at the gift as though it were a child's craft project. "How sweet," she said. "But our walls are already full. Brianna ordered an oil portrait for your father painted by a real artist." The word real was dropped very lightly, but it landed exactly where it hurt most. My father set the framed drawing down on the side table. He did not defend the gift. He did not defend me. Celeste linked her arm through his and said the kitchen needed him to taste the wine for the party. He followed her. I remained standing in the living room facing the large portrait above the fireplace. In the painting were my father, Celeste, and Brianna. 3 people. Complete. No empty space left for me. If you were Evelyn, would you still go to the party to give your father one final chance, or would you leave early to protect your self-respect? Comment go or leave and subscribe to the channel to see what she chose. As I left, I heard Celeste's voice behind the kitchen door. "She is going to ruin the party, William. We should have security prepared." My father answered very softly. "Evelyn is still my daughter." Celeste gave a quiet laugh. "That is exactly why she needs to know her place." I walked out of that house with nothing left in my hands, but in my mind there was already a decision as heavy as stone. On Saturday night, the Whitmore Hotel shone like a palace, built to honor people who had never had to wonder whether they were allowed to enter. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, spilling golden light across marble floors, polished enough for me to see my reflection in them. I wore a midnight blue dress, simple in cut, not showy. In my ears were my mother's pearl earrings. I did not come to start a war. I came to give my father one final chance. At the reception table, the young staff member looked at the list, ran her finger down each line, then stopped. Her professional smile shifted slightly. "You are Ms. Evelyn Carter, correct. I'm sorry your name was added quite late." I looked at the pen in her hand. "How late?" She hesitated. "Yesterday." I nodded, took the place card, and stepped into the grand hall. 200 guests were already there. The clinking of glasses, laughter, and jazz music drifted through the room like a glossy coat of paint over everything rotten underneath. Then I heard the whispers. No one said anything directly to my face. Celeste did not work that crudely. She only had to plant enough seeds before I arrived, and the room would grow cruel words for her. "Is that the troubled daughter? I heard she's been unemployed for a long time. Celeste said she causes scenes. Her real mother was such a lovely woman. What a shame." I walked past them with my back straight, my hand lightly gripping my clutch. I used to think the worst pain was being misunderstood by the people inside your own home. But that night I understood a colder kind of pain. It was walking into a room full of strangers and realizing they had been given a false version of you in advance while you had no microphone to save yourself. At the far end of the room, my father stood near the stage. Celeste was on his left, Brianna on his right. They were taking photos. The photographer raised a hand, positioning them as a perfect family. The successful father, the beautiful wife, the radiant young daughter in a red dress. No one turned to look for me. No one said there was still another daughter. I stood a few steps away from them, feeling as if I were looking at a living portrait Celeste had rehearsed for years. My father saw me first. His face lit up briefly so quickly, it was almost an old reflex. But the moment Celeste placed her hand on his arm, that light went out. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm glad you came." Those 5 words were so polite they hurt. They were not the words of a father speaking to his daughter. They sounded like the host of a party greeting a guest who had been invited at the last minute. Celeste turned toward me. She wore a cream silk dress, diamonds at her throat, her hair perfectly pinned. Her smile was soft as velvet, but her eyes were cold. "Evelyn, what a surprise. I wasn't sure you would come after everything." The sentence fell into the circle of people around us, stopping in exactly the right place so their imaginations could do the rest. I looked straight at my father. "I want to speak with you privately for a moment." He leaned slightly toward me. Only half a step, but I saw it. Then Celeste tightened her hand around his arm. "William, the Hendersons are waiting. Evelyn can speak later." And my father turned away. Not because he had not heard me, but because he had heard me, understood everything, and still chose to leave. The speeches began at 8:30. Celeste was the first to hold the microphone, as though the party had been organized to honor her, not my father. She stood beneath the stage lights in her cream silk dress, the diamonds at her throat, catching the light every time she tilted her head. Her voice was warm, smooth, and carefully practiced, like a piece of music that never missed a note. She thanked the partners, the friends, and the people who had stood beside William Carter through 35 years of his career. She spoke about family, about loyalty, about the people who truly make a house, a home. When she said that, she pulled Brianna onto the stage and embraced her as the whole room applauded. My name was not mentioned. Neither was my mother's. I stood near the aisle, my hand touching the small velvet box inside my clutch. Inside was my mother's brass compass, the gift I had planned to give my father in private. I did not want to cause a scene. I only wanted to place it in his hand and tell him that once he had known the way home. When Celeste finished her speech, applause rose around the room. I stood up. No one noticed the first 10 steps. On the 11th, Celeste saw me. Her smile did not disappear. She only tilted her head very slightly, as though the scene she had been waiting for had arrived exactly on cue. I was still a few yards from the stage when she lifted the microphone close to her lips. "Where is security?" The entire room went still. Celeste looked straight at me, her voice still terrifyingly gentle. "Please remove this woman from the room. She was not invited, and she is causing a disturbance." The jazz music stopped halfway through a phrase, leaving behind a humiliating emptiness. I stood in the middle of the aisle in my midnight blue dress, wearing my mother's pearl earrings, still holding the velvet box. 2 security guards approached. Brianna raised her phone. A few guests turned their faces away, but no one intervened. Polite people are often very good at looking down into their wine glasses when something wrong happens in front of them. I looked at my father. William Carter stood only 3 steps away from me. 3 steps to stand beside his daughter. 3 steps to reclaim 23 years he had lost. 3 steps to tell the entire room that I belonged to this family. He opened his mouth. Then Celeste placed her hand on his arm. My father looked at her, looked at me, then looked down at the floor. In that moment, what broke inside me was not my love for my father. That love had been cracked for a long time. What broke was the final hope that he would choose me. If you also think the moment a father lowers his eyes hurts more than a stepmother's insult, comment "silence is a choice too," and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the twist that comes right after this. The security guard on my left said quietly, "Ma'am, we have to ask you to leave." I did not resist. I placed the velvet box on the nearest table. Then I looked at my father one last time. "I came here for you," I said. "Not for her. But now I have seen your choice." I turned away. Behind me, Celeste laughed back into the microphone. "I apologize everyone for the interruption. Shall we continue?" And the room truly did. The hotel doors closed behind me, muffling the music and laughter, but they could not block the cold. October in New York always has a kind of wind that reminds you winter is standing somewhere very close. I walked down the stone steps slowly without looking back. I used to think that if I were ever pushed out of my own family, I would cry. I imagined I would tremble, call someone, need a hand to hold me steady. But as I stood under the awning of the Whitmore Hotel, the only thing I felt was a strange stillness. Not peace. It was the kind of stillness that comes right after a bridge inside. you finally collapses, and you know there is no way back. I sat down on the highest step. The cold stone cut through the fabric of my dress, but I let it. Inside, my father was probably sitting back down at the table. Celeste was probably smiling again. Brianna had probably already sent the video of me being escorted out to a few close friends with some cruel little joke attached. And I sat outside wearing my mother's pearls, looking at my blurred reflection on my phone screen. I gave myself 1 minute. 1 minute to hurt because of what Celeste had said. 1 minute to hurt because the entire room had stayed silent. 1 minute to hurt because the man who had once held me at my mother's funeral could not take 3 steps to stand beside me. After that minute, I stood up. My mother did not teach me to sit forever on someone else's doorstep. I walked the parking lot. My old Subaru sat in the far corner, small among the polished luxury cars. I opened the door, sat in the driver's seat, and took my laptop from the back seat onto my lap. The blue light from the screen covered my hands, making the pearls in the rearview mirror glow like 2 quiet dots. I called Henry Alden first. He answered immediately, as though he had been sitting beside the phone all evening. Ems. Carter. I'm ready, I said. He did not ask what had happened. Maybe people who work with wills and betrayal long enough understand that when a woman says she is ready in a voice that calm, it means her heart has been pushed to the very edge. Henry read me the confirmation code. Then I called Rebecca Lane, the fund manager. Her voice was professional and clear. Once I receive the electronic signature and the verification code, I can complete the transfer in less than an hour. Send me the documents. The email arrived right after that. I opened each page and read every line carefully. Not because I doubted my mother, but because my mother had once said that everything beautiful begins with structure, and tonight I would not sign anything unless I understood the foundation beneath it. My name appeared at the bottom of the document. Evelyn Margaret Carter. I placed my finger on the trackpad. In that brief moment, I thought of the 11-year-old girl who had lowered her head when her father said she was going to have a new mother. I thought of dinners at the small table. I thought of my bedroom turning into a yoga room. I thought of my father lowering his eyes in front of more than 200 people. Then I signed. There was no thunder. No background music. Only one confirmation line appearing on the screen. Transfer order in process. 47 minutes later, Rebecca called back. The transfer is complete. $17 million is now in your private trust. I closed. The laptop turned off my phone, started the car and drove back to Brooklyn. That night, for the first time in a very long time, I was not driving to escape. I was driving because I finally knew which direction I was going. When I got back to Brooklyn, my small third-floor apartment was as quiet as it was every night. The wooden floor creaked softly under my feet. The kettle sat on the stove, and the bookshelves I had restored by hand stood against the wall like old friends. I took off my coat, removed my mother's pearl earrings, placed them on the vanity, then turned on my phone. The screen lit up almost immediately. 12 missed calls. Then 29. Then 56. They had never called me that many times in all the past years combined. Not on my birthday. Not on my mother's death anniversary. Not when I once lay alone in this apartment with a fever. But the moment the money stopped flowing in the direction they wanted, the whole family suddenly remembered that my phone number still existed. The first message was from Brianna. What did you do? The second was from Celeste. You had no right. That is family money. Then Brianna texted again. My card was declined. You are joking, right? The last one was from my father. Evelyn, please call me back. We need to talk. I placed the phone face down on the kitchen table. I did not call back. I made chamomile tea, sat down in the armchair by the window, and let the apartment hold me in its gentle normalness. Outside late night, Brooklyn carried the distant sound of cars. someone closing a door down on the street and wind slipping through the gaps of the old windows. Those sounds felt more real than anything my family had ever said to me in the gold-trimmed living room in Westchester. Later, Eleanor told me what happened inside the hotel. 5 minutes after the transfer was completed, Brianna went to the bar to order more drinks for her friends. The first card was declined. She gave an awkward laugh and handed over a second card. That one was declined too. By the third card, the bartender's smile had frozen. Almost at the same time, Celeste received an urgent notification from the fund management company. She left the dance floor called Rebecca Lane, and for the first time in her life, her perfect voice was stopped by another woman's procedure. A beneficiary has exercised the right to withdraw a separately protected asset, Rebecca said. I cannot disclose anything further over the phone. Celeste opened the fund portal on her phone. That morning, the account had still shown $42 million. Now it showed only about $25 million. The transaction line was their brief and non-negotiable withdrawal of separately protected asset. Beneficiary: Evelyn M. Carter. Eleanor said Celeste's face turned as white as though the stage lights had just gone out. She pulled my father near the coat check and whispered in a voice with no honey left in it. Did you know about this? My father looked at the screen, then toward the exit where I had disappeared. For the first time that night, perhaps he understood that his silence had just come with a price. At 11:15 that night, the intercom downstairs rang. I looked at the screen beside the door and saw all three of them standing in front of my brownstone. My father was still wearing his tuxedo, his tie loosened his face gray beneath the streetlight. Celeste was still in her cream silk dress, but her makeup had settled into dark lines beneath her eyes. Brianna stood behind her mother, holding her phone with both hands, as though the last thing she owned had just been taken from her. I looked at them for a long time, before pressing the button to open the door. For 23 years, I had always been the one who went to their house, sat at their table, and lived under their rules. That night, for the first time, they had to climb 3 flights of old stairs to enter a place that belonged to me. Celeste spoke the moment she crossed the threshold. How dare you do this to this family? I raised my hand just enough to stop her. You are standing in my home, Celeste. Lower your voice or leave. She froze as though no one had ever spoken to her that way before. My father sat down in the armchair by the window. Brianna stayed at the edge of the sofa. Celeste remained standing as if she still controlled the room. I placed the file on the coffee table. That money was never yours, I said. And it was never entirely Dad's either. I pushed the trust agreement toward them. Those $17 million were my mother, Margaret Hale's inheritance. She placed it into the Carter family fund with a separate protection clause. I am the sole beneficiary. Celeste laughed, but the sound broke halfway through. Fake documents. I looked at my father. You knew this, didn't you? William Carter lowered his head. His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. Your mother set it up before she died, he said hoarsely. I should have told you. Celeste snapped her head toward him. You knew. The room sank into silence. 23 years of quiet finally had a shape. It was no longer an empty space. It was a confession. I placed the second document on the table. My mother's final amendment signed before she died. From my 30th birthday, I had the right to move that money into my own trust without anyone's approval. Brianna looked at me, her voice smaller now. I didn't know. I believe you didn't know about the trust, I replied. But you knew I was erased from family photos. You knew I was pushed away from the dinner table. You knew your mother called me trouble. You knew, and you still recorded the video tonight. Brianna lowered her face. For the first time, she had no answer. If you think Celeste went too far, comment cross the line and subscribe to the channel, because what Evelyn is about to place on the table will leave the whole room even more speechless. Celeste changed her voice. Her chin trembled, and her hand moved to her chest. After everything I have done for this family, you tear it apart because of greed. I did not argue. I only pulled the final sheet from behind the file. This is the email you sent to your lawyer 6 months ago. You accidentally copied Henry Alden on it. I read it aloud slowly. We have to act before Evelyn discovers Margaret's claws. William does not have the backbone to stop us. Brianna deserves that share more. The air seemed to drain from the room. My father picked up the paper. He read it once. Then again. When he looked up at Celeste, his eyes were no longer confused. They were hurt but awake. Celeste, he said. You plan to take Margaret's money from her daughter. Celeste did not answer. And her silence finally was more honest than every speech about family she had ever given. After that email, my apartment became so quiet I could hear the old radiator ticking softly against the wall. Celeste stood in the middle of the room, her hand still gripping her handbag, but all the authority in her posture had fallen away like paint peeling from a damp wall. No more sweet voice. No more false pity in her eyes. Only a woman caught standing on a foundation that did not belong to her. My father did not shout. Perhaps a part of me had once wanted him to get angry, to slam his hand on the table, to do something large enough to make up for 23 years of doing nothing. But William Carter only sat there, the email trembling slightly in his hand. He aged right in front of me, not because of time, but because for the first time he saw the true cost of avoidance. Evelyn, he said, his voice so hoarse it nearly broke. I'm sorry? I had waited for that sentence for half my life. But when it finally came, I did not feel the relief I once imagined. An apology could not put my mother's photographs back in the hallway. It could not return the seat beside my father at Thanksgiving dinners. It could not erase the memory of him lowering his eyes while security walked toward me. I know you're sorry, I said. But sorry is no longer enough. I placed 4 conditions in front of him. The $17 million would stay in my private trust without negotiation. The amendment Celeste had prepared had to be canceled in writing. My father had to hire his own attorney, not one connected to Celeste. And if he wanted to step back into my life, he had to do it directly with the truth, not through the woman who had tried to erase me. Celeste let out a dry laugh. You think you can give your own father conditions? I looked at her. No. I'm giving conditions to the man who let me be humiliated in front of 200 people. My father closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he nodded. All right. Just one word, but it made Celeste go pale. She picked up her handbag and said, This was not over. I stood and opened the door. For me, it is over. The rest is just the consequence of your choices. 3 days later, those consequences arrived. The bank sent a letter demanding additional collateral because the Carter Fund had a serious shortfall after my mother's portion was transferred out. 2 of my father's commercial properties had to be put up for sale. His private attorney discovered that Celeste had withdrawn millions of dollars over the years under the name of family expenses, but most of it had gone to shopping, travel, jewelry, and a vacation house held in her own name. Brianna disappeared from social media. No more dresses. No more perfect family quotes. A week later, she sent me a short message. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough to owe you an apology. I did not answer yet. As for my father, for the first time in many years, he called me himself. Not through Celeste. Not through a secretary. He asked if I would meet him for coffee. I looked at the phone for a long time, then said yes. Not because I had forgiven him, but because some buildings, before they can be restored, need to be inspected to see whether the foundation can still hold. 3 months later, I stood in an old ballroom in Washington, where the vaulted ceiling had been restored by hand, and the iron railings still carried patterns from more than a century ago. This time, no one called security. No one looked at me as though I were an extra guest. On the screen were large words. The Margaret Hale Fund, preserving what deserves to be saved, I used part of the money my mother had left me to create that fund. The first project was an old community center in Baltimore, a place that had been abandoned after the neighborhood had been forgotten for years. I chose it because beneath the cracked brick and broken windows, the structure was still standing. Just as I once had to learn to believe that I was too. My father sat alone in the front row wearing a dark blue suit. Celeste was not beside him. Brianna was not behind him, turning him into part of a perfect portrait. There was only William Carter, older, quieter, and for the first time truly looking at me. I spoke about forgotten buildings. About how people often tear down what is old simply because they do not have enough patience to look at the foundation. I spoke about my mother, an architect whose own daughter had needed 23 years to learn the truth. Some structures do not need to be completely remade. They only need someone brave enough to uncover what was real all along. When I finished, the whole room rose to applaud. My father was the first to stand. After the ceremony, he found me near the exit. In his hands was a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the drawing of his first building, the gift I had once left behind in Westchester. He had framed it in walnut wood and preservation glass. "It has always been on the wall in my study," he said. I just never had the courage to tell Celeste. I held the framed drawing against my chest. This time I did not say it was okay. I only said, "Thank you, Dad. That means something to me." Brianna sent me a handwritten letter. 3 pages with no excuses and no blame shifted elsewhere. Only the apology of someone beginning to understand that her privilege had been built on someone else's silence. I placed that letter beside my mother's. I had not answered it yet, but I did not tear it up either. If this story reminds you of a time when you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, comment dignity, and subscribe to the channel to keep listening to stories about justice that comes late but is never meaningless. I used to think strength meant enduring. It meant going to every dinner, sitting in the extra chair, swallowing every insult and telling myself that was family. But now I understand that sometimes strength is walking out of the room where people need you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. My mother did not only leave me money, she left me a structure. A load-bearing wall. A path back to myself. And on that path, for the first time, I was no longer the useless daughter in someone else's story. I am Evelyn Carter. And at last I am allowed to take up space in my own life.